Hi everybody, just a quick note before we get started today. You'll notice that it's a bit of a shorter episode, as well as it being a little later in the day than we usually release. That's because we're having to do a solo episode today with just me. So for all you fans of Amy, which is everybody, but we apologize. She won't be able to join us this time around. There were some technical difficulties as well as an issue with her library's subscription to the OED, which unfortunately got cut due to budget cuts. And all these things conspired to leave me recording on my own this week, but we'll be back on our regular schedule next week, so that's why it's both late and short. So apologies for that, but now on with the show. Hello and welcome to Lexitecture, a podcast about word origins and histories. My name is Ryan, and in each episode my friend Amy and I bring a new pair of words to share their stories with each other and you. You can find our past episodes and the occasional blog post on our website at lexitecture.com. Follow along with us on Twitter and Facebook at Lexitecture. And if you really like what we do, you can support the show at patreon.com/Lexitecture. Today's episode, Vicious Vice. Before we get started today, we'd just like to send out a huge appreciative, deep, heartfelt thanks to Alex Schubel, who is our newest Patreon supporter. Honestly, seeing listener numbers and looking at maps, seeing where we've got listeners and getting emails and watching Facebook comments and shares and likes and all the rest and retweets and everything coming is amazing, and the support is truly appreciated by us. The extra bump we get in confidence and morale and just wow, we didn't know this could even be a thing at all, from people supporting us financially on Patreon and making this a sustainable endeavor is just amazing. We've always wanted to be able to do this on a more regular basis and longer term. When we started this, it was a bit of a lark, but it became fun and a surprisingly huge part of our lives. So this is awesome. And I've always preferred the idea of keeping it sustainable by making it a community of people who are into it and having that be our kind of model. I don't have anything at all against ads when I'm listening to podcasts. I realize that things cost money and that supporters or creators need to support themselves and the work that they do. I've always just sort of felt like I'd prefer to go this way to the ad route. So it's really nice to be able to keep doing that. And so thank you to all of our Patreon sponsors and to Alex for being the newest one all aboard that bandwagon. And as you heard in the intro, if you'd like to hear what all this is about or maybe look into supporting the show yourself, patreon.com/Lexitecture is the way to go. As you also heard at the beginning, you're stuck with just me today. Amy will be back in a couple of weeks when we do our next episode, but for now, it's me, so let's just get started. My word today is vicious. I chose this one, and again, for anyone listening who's familiar with the podcast, The Endless Knot, which is an awesome one, one of the first language podcasts I started listening to, and it's just been great to listen to, and Mark and Avon are awesome. Their podcast takes a more thematic approach, deals with etymology on the way and a bunch of other themes, and that's sort of, I'm kind of dipping into their bag with this one a little bit, because it's kind of looking more broadly at the theme of the word and a couple different interrelated things, but it is still housed, everything I'm talking about is still housed within the word itself. So it's not a complete departure from Lexitecture format, but we're already departing a little bit because it's just me, so I figured why not. So vicious is where I started. Other word nerds might be able to attest to this phenomenon where you look at a word that you've seen before, maybe you see it all the time, definitely fairly common, but something about the way it's presented or the way you look at it or just the way you're feeling that day makes you look at it in a bit of a different way and maybe raises your eyebrows a little bit, and you kind of go, oh wait, is that connected to this other thing, and how and why, and if not, why not? And this was one of those words I hadn't really given it a whole lot of thought until I thought about it just the other day. I don't even remember the context in which I heard about it, but I started thinking, so I started doing some research. And vicious as an adjective shows up, according to the OED, in sort of the mid-1300s. It's 1340s is where it's first attested. It arrives in basically the same grammatical form. You'd use it the same way as you do now. It has a bit of a different tinge to the meaning. So it originally just meant having the nature of a vice, a moral failing of some sort. So a vicious habit would be a habit that revolves around and involves and perpetuates sort of behavior that's kind of deemed substandard or undesirable. And a vicious person would be someone who's inclined to those types of habits and behaviors. What it was missing originally, or what it seems to have been missing originally, is the sense that I kind of get from vicious now, and I feel like it's most used to denote now, is violence or cruelty or savagery or danger, something along those lines. Someone who is vicious because of the way they treat other people or other things. It's an outward kind of idea rather than just an internal thing. Someone who is, you may not have a high view of gambling. You may consider gambling a vice, but you wouldn't necessarily call a gambler vicious just because they like to go to the casino or like to bet on the horses or whatever else that they do. But originally that was sort of what it did mean. It has always been quote-unquote bad from the point of view of people who establish and control what these things are and whether they're good or bad. But it was more generally bad. It didn't have that that interrelational idea of being vicious or cruel. The idea of cruelty or not necessarily cruelty, but savagery and danger came around in the 1700s when vicious would be applied to animals, which sort of is kind of weird because they're already getting away from the moral idea of things. But it was originally used to talk about horses. And horses that were particularly difficult to train would be called vicious because they were savage and wild and dangerous. And then it seems like that's where we get our more common modern use of the word vicious. Started in the 1700s and started to do with horses. But way earlier, it was, like I say, more broadly moral and judgmental. It was also a legal term, a kind of technical legal term in the late 14th century. And it was used to denote something that was null and void because of a fault or defect. So a contract could be vicious if one of its main clauses was drafted poorly or wrong or was based in some error of law or argument. And you see this when you see things getting vitiated. Same idea, same root. So if someone's consent for something can be vitiated if it was under duress, for instance. If they were forced into something, the consent doesn't count because they were forced into it. It's not real. It's vitiated. And that's where that kind of comes from. Another interesting descendant of that idea of vicious is what we call a vicious circle now. And when I think about a vicious circle now, at least for me, I think of a set of circumstances or a situation or a pattern of behavior that perpetuates itself. So I did a legal internship with the local legal aid duty council a few months ago, and you deal with a lot of bails courts and sort of petty crime and those type of things, and you see the kind of vicious circle where someone who has an addiction problem will end up being rounded up by the police. They'll be arrested. They'll be charged. They'll be released on bail, but their bail conditions usually involve staying away from drugs and alcohol. But of course, they have an addiction issue, so that lands them back in jail, and not on the original charges, but on the charges of now breaking their conditions. And so that's this kind of vicious cycle, because then they're in the prison system, they can't get a job, blah, 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 blah. That's what I sort of think of as a vicious circle now. But there was a technical meaning, and I'm sure it still exists in logic circles, where a vicious circle was a kind of argument that was flawed in such a way that it would result in a sort of perpetual motion machine of mistake. You'd never be able to get out of the conclusions of this argument because it just kind of keeps leaning back on itself. And that's what a vicious circle originally was. But that's still tapping into that neutral but broken sense of the original sort of 1340s usage of it. Etymologically, the word vicious comes from vice. We've said that a couple of times already in this chat. And vice comes originally from French, and then, of course, from Latin before that. The Latin word is vitium or witium, depending on how your Latin professor leaned as far as whether the V was pronounced as a V or a W in classical Latin. Mine was always the W, so I can't get away from the W, so I would say witium normally. But witium just meant a defect, an offense, a blemish, or an imperfection, something along those lines. So again, not necessarily a moral judgment, just a flaw and a fault. Interesting sidebar here as I was looking through the history of it and got to the French. In the 1940s, the OED has a French sort of idiom called the English vice, le vice anglais. And it's attested from 1942, and this particular vice is a fetish for corporal punishment. So, make of that what you will, but the English vice, love them some corporal punishment. I'll say no more on that. So, but so far it's been pretty straightforward. Everything seems pretty related. It does the normal ebbs and flows of moralism and judgmentalism. It goes from being sort of objective but just broken and defective to morally hazardous in varying levels to being just dangerous with horses, and then back to moral judgments now, and now just being objectively like dangerous and bad and offensive and all the rest. One of the things that got me really thinking about this was the other places we see the word vice. So we see the word vice in front of the word president to form the vice president rank. You see it, variations of it with viscount, vice regent, these type of ideas. And opinions on politics aside and current administrations or past, it struck me as a bit weird to think that the vice and vice president was some sort of moral judgment on the person who held that office. So I figured that couldn't really be the case. And it turns out it's not. So the vice and vice president comes from the Latin word vicis or vicis, W-I, no, not W-I, there I did it, see? V-I-C-I-S, vicis, meaning place, stead, change, or turn. And it's funny, place and stead, those are all hard words to do when you're not just reading. So if you're standing in someone's place, that's where the stead, you might see the word instead, for instance, but you know, in his stead, I will go and fight the dragon. For some reason, is the thing that comes to my mind, but in someone's place. So the person who stands in someone else's place is that person's vice, the vice person for that. So the vice president. Another place we see vice is in the word advice. And this is one of those cases where you'd be really... I love folk etymology because it just makes so much sense, and sometimes it's so much fun to follow and just kind of interesting to believe. This is one of those instances where it would be very easy to folk etymologize. Sure, that's a word now. The word advice. And just kind of make some guesses, and some educated guesses, right? Because we know that the prefix ad is sort of has a directional prepositional element to it in Latin. So adventure, you're called to adventure. You are called to that particular undertaking. So you might think add vice to a vice, maybe to a moral failing. Maybe advice came from bad advice. Some advice was a thing that led you towards a moral impediment or something. But anyway, all that stuff would be completely wrong. So this is an example where folk etymology would bring you down the entirely wrong path. Advice comes from the Old French avis, A-V-I-S, meaning opinion, judgment, or idea. And the reason that it went from an S to a C is one of these kind of norms. I won't call them rules because that's a bit prescriptive for my particular tastes. One of these norms are just sort of habits that English falls into. It's spelled with a C, basically to differentiate it from advise, A-D-V-I-S-E, which is a verb. And Etym has a fun little list of noun-verb pairings where the verb gets an S and the noun gets a C. And so you get things like advice and advise. You get things like peace and appease, and device and devise. So these are all examples where the pronunciation of the last syllable changes. So the S gives it the sort of Z sound, the voiced sound, and the C has the unvoiced sound. Sometimes it doesn't actually change in pronunciation. So the Etymon gives practice with a C and an S and license with a C and an S. To my mind, I'd always seen those things like to license someone or you have license to do something. I've seen both spelled both ways. And I've seen them described as North American English versus British English differences. So it seems muddy on that, but it seems like originally maybe the license with an S was the verb form. So to license someone always had an S, and you were received a license from someone with a C. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case anymore, but it just goes to show how these things can change. The last one was prophecy and prophesy, where the pronunciation change, of course, happens on the Y, but to prophesy is to issue a prophecy, and when you prophesy, you use an S, and to prophecy, you use, and a prophecy uses a C. So that is my little journey. So advice and vice president, no matter what folk etymology or political leanings might lead you to believe, have nothing to do with vice, the moral failing, or just objective default. Interestingly enough, there was another sort of weird thing, and this is, I would assume, one of the pitfalls, dangers, risks inherent in constructing a proto-language like Proto-Indo-European. So the idea with pi, which we always love looking into, is that it's probably stronger than a theoretical language, but it's reverse engineered from all the languages that came after it. So when you talk about a pi root, a Proto-Indo-European root, it's theorized and most educatedly guessed at from the various words that come from it. But all three of these, so vitium for moral vice, vicis or vicis for vice president, and avis, the Old French for opinion, where we get advice, all come from Proto-Indo-European roots that are transliterated into English as the same, exact same spelling in all three of the cases, but completely different meanings. So I don't know what to draw from that, but it's sometimes you just don't know. And sometimes, truly speaking, nobody knows. But also for people who bemoan English's which is which, words that sound the same and don't have it remotely the same meanings, know that even speakers of Proto-Indo-European, if it worked anywhere close to where we think it did, faced the same thing. So they all had the same problems. Things don't actually really change all that much, it seems. But yes, that wraps up my little exploration into vicious and vice. Hope you enjoyed it. Amy and I will see you again next time. So take care of yourselves, and we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks. And that's it for another episode of Lexitecture. To get in touch with us about something you heard this episode, you can email us at words@lexitecture.com. You can also follow along and talk to us at Lexitecture on Facebook and Twitter, and at Lexitecture Podcast on Instagram. For back episodes and the occasional blog post, visit us at Lexitecture.com. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again soon.